We will get started. My name is Allison Williams, and I am the Chief Learning Officer at Idealis. And I'm excited to welcome you all today to our webinar. Very creative title, The Elephant and the Donkey in the Room, Talking Politics at Work. And I'm going to invite our two presenters, Simona DeGraaf, who is the founder and CEO of Idealis, and John Dick, who is the founder and CEO of CivicScience, to join us. And they are going to lead us through this discussion. Before they start, I want to orient you all to your screens a little bit. There are a few things that you're going to see. There's a place where you can chat and ask questions. So you'll see a Q&A button there that you can use to submit questions, and I will make sure to share those with our panelists and let them answer them. You can talk with each other, so feel free. If you hear something that Simona says that really resonates, please feel free to share an emoji, a reaction, or a comment or question in that way as well. You'll also see related materials, and there are some materials about the pulse of the U.S. workforce there for you to review or download and take with you. You'll have access to those after the webinar as well. You'll also notice a research brief that you can download about this topic and some sample slides from the pulse of the U.S. workforce. So those things are there. And finally, you'll see bios about our two presenters today. So with that, I'm going to let them briefly introduce themselves and get us started. So Simona and John, welcome and thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Allison. Great to be here.
Simona, you want to kick us off?
Hi, everyone. I am Simona DeGraaf. I'm the CEO founder of Idealis, and I'll hand it off to John to introduce himself.
Hey, I'm John Dick, founder and CEO of CivicScience, coming to you from the chilly city of Pittsburgh today.
Well, I'm in Amsterdam. I don't know who's more chilly, but less snow, I think, here. It's great to see you both, and so great to have everyone here on the line. Instead of doing intros and sort of talking through our bios, as Allison said, there's details about who we are and what we do for a living, that this webinar is not about us. It is about you. This is our most attended webinar yet. So it seems like talking politics at work is something folks want to talk about. So that is what we're going to spend more time talking about. And I will also say this webinar is about the 200,000 people's voices that are represented in this data. So you'll hear a bit about John's work at CivicScience and the partnership we have in really trying to capture the human sentiment and the experiences that people are having. And so a lot of this data is less about our points of view, but is really both our life's work of making sure we raise other people's points of views and perspectives so that we understand one another a little bit better. So with that, I want to jump a little bit into what the pulse of the U.S. workforce is all about and the people that are represented in this data. So when John and I joined forces between Idealis and CivicScience, we realized we had this common mission and passion around understanding how people think, feel, act, decide, behave. I've always done it in the context of the workplace. John's done it in the context of the workplace, but through a consumer lens. And so when our powers combined, Captain Planet-like, what we realized was there's a lot of really interesting things happening on a day-to-day basis for people at work, and we ought to keep a pulse on it. And that's what the pulse of the U.S. workforce is all about. It's a chance for us to benchmark worker experiences, attitudes that people have about work in a way that's reliable and relevant and timely. And if you look at what's behind this data, we mirror our sample of several 100,000 people against the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So the workforce of the U.S. is represented in our database. So you're going to see data from people of all age ranges, men, women, all employed adults who are actively participating in the workforce. We've got data on people who are in household incomes of over or under $100,000, people who work for different company sizes, different industries, all races. And there's a lot of geographic representation in this data as well, which particularly on this topic of politics at work is really important. To add anything on just methodology here, John, since this is your life's work and passion?
No, I think you nailed it. We really try to focus on the scale. So we won't bore everyone with our methodology, but we've developed a really unique way of gathering survey data. Lots and lots of it. We've done gathered over 6 billion surveys responses in the time that we've been running this business, millions on the daily. And it just allows us to kind of study the full breadth of the human condition, which we'll get a little bit more into some of the philosophy underlying all that as we go. But no, you did a great job of laying it out, Simona.
Thank you. I've been well trained by you and your team. Um, Here's what I would highlight. There's obviously methodology, and there are a lot of questions that we ask of lots of people. But part of why we spent the time right at the beginning about how we sample is there is so much information and sometimes misinformation about what's happening in the world. And so knowing that the data is relevant and reliable and representative of the people that we live and work alongside is really important. And we're flipping to this slide here just so that you all sort of understand and can hear what brought us to this work. This Pulse of the U.S. Workforce, and particularly this topic, is sampling over 220,000 workers. And we've been looking at their data for the past 6 months, though John has been looking at this data for decades. And so a couple of things that we've learned here. One is, as somebody who spent all of her time with her team on understanding worker sentiment, people have attitudes and perspectives that change every single day as human beings. The things that we're exposed to, the things that we're feeling, our life circumstance, it can impact us on how we think, act, work, engage on a daily basis. So part of what we're always looking for and paying attention to is how is that changing as things around us change. And so today we're going to talk about the political piece of this, but I'm going to hand it over to John to talk about a little bit of what he's been seeing for the last several years that he's been doing this work, just to set the context of the work we're doing here.
Yeah, so kind of elevating to a high level of how we at CivicScience view the world, I generally reduce things to lots of taglines around here, and I'm going to just share two of those that I think are particularly relevant to today's conversation. Number one is our belief that attitudes change before behaviors do. And that's important because all of us, and I'm sure many of you joining us today, have access to more behavioral data than you know what to do with. Whether, empirical data from the Department of Labor or your own data from your own business. And there's historically been a shortage of data at scale about people's hopes and needs and wants and fears and likes and dislikes and tastes and such. And we know and have been able to prove over the years that shifts in those attitudes and feelings are foretell of future changes in behavior. Survey research gets some well-deserved knocks on it because oftentimes people mistake it as a measurement mechanism. And yes, while we are certainly trying to measure certain things, survey data's real power is in its ability to anticipate behavioral and observed changes in the future. And so we'll talk a lot about these things today in terms of people's political views and their attitudes about politics and work, but we want to look at it through a lens of what is it going to mean about their behavior in the future, their job satisfaction, their willingness to maybe go look for a new job. The second motto I'll mention, which is a little bit more of a mouthful, another motto of CivicScience, is that everything affects everything and everything's constantly changing, so we study everything constantly. We want everyone to try to broaden their views a bit in terms of what matters to their business and their workers. We often think in very sort of myopic ways about the things that maybe my industry, my category, my workforce, but realize that there are things happening in a person's life outside of work, at work, that are having potentially invisible or at least subconscious impacts on the way they approach work. And so we want to kind of broaden, come at today's conversation from those somewhat lofty places, and you'll see that sort of interwoven in the data as we work through it.
Amazing. And John, something you just said, and we'll jump into the data here, is people have hopes, dreams, fears, aspirations, and they're constantly changing. What we learned in this data, a couple of different punchlines. One is our political identities certainly reflect a lot about us and those hopes, dreams, fears, aspirations, things that we care about, things that we value. And how we lean politically does impact how we experience work and the perspectives we have at work. There are distinct clusters of results that we've seen between people who have different political leanings and how they feel about certain topics. The other thing we noticed is that there are patterns across the political spectrum, whether people lean liberal or people lean more conservative, or people lean more moderate, in terms of how they feel about their boss, how they feel about companies, the role of business in the world, which we sort of know, but to recognize that these are feelings that people bring to work, which is ultimately going to impact people's experiences at work and the cultures that they create around them. So what we've seen in our data, and we're going to reveal a lot of this, and you're welcome to take notes and share this, is we know politics are being talked about at work because politics are a part of how we see the world, particularly now as it's really sort of in mainstream media and in our face all the time. And so it's a conversation worth talking about. And that's part of why we've devoted quite a bit of time as a team to really dig into this with you and for you so we can make sense of it.
Simona, I want to add one thing to that, because a lot of what we're talking about here is kind of nearer term, shorter term trends, but we've been, as you mentioned, been studying this stuff for well over a decade. A lot of these things we're talking about are relatively new phenomena, right? These weren't really in the last 10 years, and you can kind of trace it to a few political events over that period of time where this has become where people historically maybe left their politics at home and didn't talk about politics at work. It was like, when we grew up, you didn't talk about religion or politics at the dinner table, and those days are gone. And so this is relatively new stuff, and we're adapting to it on the fly.
Totally. And look, in the conversations I have with HR leaders in particular, people are having to adopt their company policies and their ways of which they handle conversations about politics at work because it is a new phenomenon. So I think part of what we're seeing is this general adaptation to politics is much more of a meta identity, a thing I walk around with, whereas in the past it might have just been an aspect of how I see the world. Something we saw that was interesting in the data, again, of the over 200,000 people that we surveyed, we noticed that the registered political party, we saw a large percentage of people actually registered Republican, Democrat, Independent, you can see that. But the wheels are different when you actually look at people's political leanings. And so one of the interesting takeaways that we had was not everybody who's a registered Republican leans conservative, and not everybody who's a registered liberal who's a registered Democrat leans liberal. And in fact, the biggest chunk of our population that we sampled leaned moderate. So 45% of the people that we talked to and interviewed and surveyed and worked with their data are actually in the middle. And when given a binary choice of who to vote for, they go with the registered party. So what that says to us as we think about how politics are playing a role at work is there are a lot of people who are still sort of figuring out what they think and believe and feel. And those perspectives can get shaped by who we're exposed to, how we talk about it, and in some ways, the work environment that we're in. The other thing we'll just quickly reflect on here is we know that the United States at this point has a pretty divisive landscape when it comes to political perspectives. So what we've been able to do is look at the political affiliation of people across the US Census data that exists and make sure that our data isn't skewing too much in one geography for another. So this really does represent how people all around the country feel about politics, which is important for those of you who work in organizations that have representation in lots of different places. Two indices that we track with John, and John's been tracking for far longer than I've been tracking it with him, are how do people feel about the economy, and how do people feel about their own sort of personal wealth and ability to spend money, save money, invest money, and make investments. So I want to pause here and give John a chance to speak to these two indices. There's something really interesting that we're seeing here between Democrats, Republicans, and independents. John.
Yeah, it's another secular trend, I think we can call it at this point, that we first started seeing in our data all the way back in around 2013. James Carville said very famously in 1992 during the presidential election, quote, "It's the economy, stupid." And that sort of views of the economy ultimately dictated how people voted and their political persuasion. And what's really happened over the last decade is those things have gotten conflated in a way that my socio-political views and my economic views are kind of a cocktail of one another in ways that really historically they never were before. I mean, to put it more simply, if I took two people with identical incomes, net worth, job security, home value, and I ask those two people how they feel about either the economy or their personal financial situation, I will get two different answers from a Republican and a Democrat, right? So it's maybe these measures have become less of a read on people's real state or real financial state, and more of kind of a sense of like hope and fear based on, quite frankly, who's leading the economy. And so you can see our economic sentiment index is really the most dramatic one, where economic views, which is my perceptions of the housing market, the job market, the economy, my savings, my debt, changed dramatically in November. And if I showed you this chart going back to 2020 and 2016, you'd see the exact same kind of flip-flopping happening. Not that anyone's financial, debt load or job status changed the day after the election, but their attitudes did. And what that means, as if you're in a leadership position in a business or an HR position in a business, is to understand that two people in your company, depending on their political persuasion, could have completely different views on their job security. They could have completely different financial sensitivity about salary and income and so on. And nothing else about them at face value might appear different other than how the political landscape is impacting their view of their personal finances and the economy. It's arguably the most profound trend we've seen in 6 billion surveys over the last decade. And I can't stress enough how important it is to kind of internalize that as a leader in a business.
What's really interesting, John, just as we've looked at the data, is one of the things you all measure is the sort of job security and perspective on the economy as it relates to my work. And obviously for many people who are workers, but also employee people, there's some consideration on, should I anticipate people are going to get a little shaky, they're going to start looking for new jobs, as we're thinking about how do we retain our best people, which is one of the things that we hear a lot of leaders think about. This is something that is an underlying factor in how people feel about whether or not they're stable in their jobs. And I think that's a really interesting thing for leaders to sort of step back and realize one day someone may feel pretty secure, and the next day, because of a political event, they feel less secure. And one of the things we're going to encourage towards the end of this is what we see is leadership makes a difference. So when we're having conversations, when we're discussing some of these topics, we might actually alleviate some of the concerns that people have, or at least help them stabilize so that it doesn't feel like these big swings because of external events. Let me jump in to something that we sort of alluded to here, which is how concerned are people about talking about politics at work? It's sort of, John, you said it, in the past, it was like one of those things you don't talk about. And now it's sort of something you always talk about. And people wear stickers on their laptops, there are flags on people's cars, there are all kinds of ways that people are expressing their political affiliation. What we found in the data was pre and post-election, almost 50% of the population expressed concern about talking about politics at work. There's worry about what happens if we talk about this. What's interesting is it flip-flopped based on level of concern, based on the party that you're a part of. So those who were conservative leaning pre-election were more worried. And then after the election, which went in the Conservative Party favor, their concern went down. So there was almost a permission to speak a little bit more, maybe less concern about it. On the flip side, liberals pre-election were more comfortable than conservatives talking about politics, but then after the election spiked in their or less comfortable, and then spiked in their concern even more when it was after the election. So there's something here, we looked at this over the course of 6 months, that certain people are more fearful of speaking up around politics at work than others. And it's important to recognize that if we look at our workforce, we probably have representation from all of these different groups. So we pause there. Reactions, thoughts, John, what would you add?
Well, I mean, I think it reiterates what we were even saying about kind of economic views, is that how quickly these things can shift. And you nailed it. The right word is kind of permission. When your political views are aligned with maybe the party not in power, there's this sense that you're kind of innately in the minority as a result of that, and so therefore you're afraid of speaking up in the event that maybe you're outnumbered in the workplace, and you could be, there could be retribution for it or whatever. And then once kind of that party change happens, and it's like, oh, I'm actually now in the majority, quote unquote. It allows for a different sense of comfort and agency to talk about these things at work. And yeah, it's changing literally by the day. I know you said you could wake up one day and it's different. That's a literal statement I think we're seeing, which really from one Tuesday to one Wednesday, the whole landscape changed.
Totally. And if we look on the next page here, one of the takeaways that we had from this data, and I've had many conversations with CHROs who said, like, I know these conversations are happening and they're creating tension. Like, I see them, I feel it. We end up dealing with all these HR complaints and people saying, like, I feel like I speak openly, or someone doesn't acknowledge my identity, and there are all these kinds of things. And there's this underlying, what we found in our data is heated political discussions are happening at work. And what we asked specifically, are they heated political discussions? And what we found was over half of the people in the US workforce have witnessed heated political discussions at work. And almost 40% of them have actually engaged in those heated political discussions themselves. So they're not just bearing witness to a conversation that might be heated and maybe a little uncomfortable, they're engaging in it. And what we also saw is when we look at this for leaders versus non-leaders, leaders are often feeling the heat the most. So they're having to bear the burden of navigating these kinds of conversations, either for their people or with their people. And what we've seen in our conversations with clients is they're not ready for it. It's tricky, it's hard. They feel like they need to have a point of view, or they can't have a point of view because it's a difficult landscape. And what we're seeing is there's some real opportunity to build the skill to navigate these kinds of conversations. Thoughts, reactions?
And I want to just pause you right there. It may fit here, but it may also be something that the two of you can just hold, and it will come up other places. But we had a question come in that was about DEI initiatives right now in the workplace, and that those were obviously very popular up until the last election. And now with the new administration, that's being upended a bit. For companies that have that initiative, thinking about how that changes and how that meshes with this data, or doesn't, and it also may be related to some of the other data that CivicScience has. So just wanted to give you that question that you may want to, consider here or as you go through the deck.
Yeah, and go ahead, John.
I mean, it almost feels like a webinar for another day. That's such a complex topic. I mean, just the sort of whiplash we've seen around support for DEI initiatives, quite frankly, not just sort of policies and companies changing and backtracking on some of those things, but even general attitudes in the population about them has just shifted. We don't often see shifts quite as dramatic and certainly as fast as we've seen that one. I feel like it may fit the conversation a little bit further as we go, because there is some interesting context around DEI initiatives that we're construing. I think there's some, I guess we'll go here now. There's obviously, an empirical change in policies and things around DE&I happening, but I think there's also maybe been this subconscious assumption that maybe it represents maybe a shift about race and sexual identity and things like that in the culture. And we just kind of published this data, I think yesterday, we wrote it up, where we were gauging people's support for brands who celebrate monthly cultural events like This is Black History Month and Pride Month in June. And our question in our system is essentially, how strongly do you support or oppose companies celebrating these kinds of events? And I will admit, before looking at the data, I kind of held my breath for a second, because I wondered, was this going to sort of follow a parallel of how we've seen attitudes towards DEI policies in workplaces? And surprisingly, and not to show my own political views too much, somewhat pleasantly, surprisingly, support for brands leaning into those cultural month events actually increased over the past year, right? So this isn't kind of necessarily a statement about racial or sexual orientation or gender issues kind of across the population, but really specific to how they view it sort of in the workplace and maybe in the hiring systems in the workplace. So as I mentioned, it's probably a full webinar topic of its own. And obviously, people may be talking about those policies at work. We didn't really ask about that stuff specifically. It's kind of pseudo-political. But it's new. There's definitely some nuance around all of this stuff. We're still just trying to understand because it's changed so fast.
Yeah, and John, I couldn't help it either. I think we have to answer the question. We did see a difference in experiences around politics at work by demographic. So in the full report, if you were to subscribe, we break all of this down based on different demographics. So we look at race, we look at gender, we look at household income, we look at education. So lots of different dimensions of one's diversity and identity. And what we've seen is that racial minorities and younger workers do tend to express greater concern over talking about politics at work, which means when we look at these DEI initiatives going away, and there's this concern around speaking openly about one's views and this kind of meta identity of what I believe about the world, there's a real challenge around unlocking the greatest potential of our fullest workforce. So if we think about the demographics of the workforce today, we need people of all different backgrounds to perform and be productive for the economy at work. And so if DEI is going to cause people, in the past, as somebody who used to practice DEI in organizations, was meant to drive productivity, create equity, create opportunities for people, ensure that people are given a fair shot, and those programs go away, and the very people that are affected by it are fearful, which is what we're seeing, that can have some real significant implications. And so what we've advised clients and many of the CEOs that I've worked with is put the initiative aside, lean on your culture and your values, right? Your initiative doesn't have to be a thing that you put on your website, but if you as an organization hold people to a bar, we create environments that people can speak openly about their beliefs and their perspectives. We train our leaders to uphold these values. There's a real opportunity there to actually lean into the very values behind DEI, even if we have to wipe the letters off of a website. It doesn't take the initiative, the true initiative, away. I actually just posted about this on LinkedIn today and got a lot of feedback on it. So it's a great question. I think what we need to understand is the experience of different people do differ on topics like politics and in general. And by taking away the initiative, it doesn't make the difference go away. It just makes the initiative go away. So I'll keep going, and please do keep the questions coming in just in the spirit of time. You know, in line with what we just talked about, we know that political discussions impact productivity at work. Now, the way that we ask the question, we don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but we can all speak to the fact that sometimes having conversations about politics can be very unproductive. I can imagine family dinners fall into that category sometime. And then on the other side, having a really great conversation about political views can really strengthen a relationship and cause people to connect at a deeper level and see each other better. And so what's interesting as we were looking at this data is we know that a majority of the population, 60% of US workers, find that heated conversations about politics do impact productivity. But the people who feel that it impacts productivity the most are actually older employees. And one might argue, you know, John, you talked about the last 10 years, our 55-plus-year-olds have been at this for a while, and our 18-plus-year-olds were almost in diapers, right, when, you know, 15 years ago, when politics were starting to sort of rumble up as a topic that was more of a tabletop conversation. And so what we're seeing is there's higher levels of concern and recognition that maybe it's not something to talk about at work because it can impact productivity, or people have gained the muscle to be able to have productive discussions. And I think this is an interesting one for us to pay attention to, especially because we know we need to build the muscle. It's not going anywhere. What do you think?
Well, I think you summarized it well. It's hard to know exactly how it impacts, right? And maybe some people intellectualize or that in at work, and some don't, right? But I do think the age differences are really important. And as you said, it partly could be because older generations like mine and older were sort of told these weren't things you talked about in the workplace or around the dinner table. Whereas younger people, it's just so much more a part of their identity at this younger age, and they talk more openly, whether it's on social media or with their friends. And so they just view it as like a much more natural course of action, a natural behavior. And also too, like you said, maybe those people who are maybe a bit older, maybe a little bit more secure in their career, feel like being able to talk about politics is having a positive impact at work, right? But there's the generational differences here are not coincidental. This is something that you might have to think differently about younger members of your workforce than older ones as you navigated it at your company.
And something we're seeing a lot of leaders do, and we've helped them, is how do you build the skills and the expectations of how to talk about it? So if you have a younger generation coming into the workforce and they're not prepared or they're not told, here's how it works around here, they're going to choose to talk about it as they've always done. Whereas an organization has a chance to sort of set the tone of how that works, and leaders do that too. You mentioned something about social media. The data showed that a third of people in the US workforce share their political points of view on social media, and 2/3 are like, absolutely not. And we do see that the younger generation are more willing to share their views on social media. And as someone who used to lead a large HR organization, we know the implications of that, because it can actually have a lot of reputational impact. It can create a lot of morale challenges if people disagree and they see your point of view, and that can come into the workplace. So there are some norms around this for sure need to be set, and organizations we've seen who've navigated this well are really clear. This is who we are and this is who we're not, even if the political landscape around us is changing. We did notice in the data that our political leanings, whether we lean liberal, lean conservative, or lean moderate, they tend to impact how we experience work. So this was an interesting one. What we found is that people who lean more conservative in their views tend to have more positive work attitudes. So if you look at this, I know this might be over some people's lunch hours, so let me break down the data. The blue is the liberal line, the yellow is the moderate line, and the orange is the conservative line. So by and large, you can see the orange lines are longer, which suggests that conservatives feel more positively about topics like CEO trust. They trust their CEO more, they admire their leaders more, they're happier on their jobs. And when we ask them the question, how engaged were you in the last week? More conservatives were engaged over time than liberals. This was an interesting one. It certainly, to your point around it, made you pause. This one made me pause because we looked at the data and really tried to understand, are these real effects? Are there true clusters? And they are. There are large enough sample sizes that we're seeing a meaningful difference between groups, particularly between the liberals and the conservatives, less so with the moderates. The moderates tend to track with the liberals in this particular population. What do we think that means?
There's a lot of history kind of manifesting in some of these numbers as well. We generally see institutional trust tends to skew right, skew a bit older, with one exception being the media today, by the way, and that's maybe another conversation for another day, but typically conservatives have more positive views of corporate America, generally like large pay disparity, CEO paid wage disparity kinds of topics that get a lot of news tend to kind of light a fire under people left of center more so than they do right. And so this is a lot of that's kind of showing up in these numbers. The job happiness one maybe doesn't kind of fit that same theme. But it could be explained by, just because I have more trust in my CEO, I have less sort of disdain for corporate America or whatever it might be, that I just generally don't carry that baggage to work with me. But yeah, I agree with you. I think that the starkness of these differences was eye-opening for me when we saw it for the first time.
And we have a question on this particular slide, John and Simona, and it is, what's the timestamp on this chart? Are we capturing a small snapshot in time related to workplace experience?
This is the beauty of the data and the report. So we looked at this data over the course of 6 months, and we did that on purpose, knowing that there was a big election event happening somewhere in there. And so this is looking at data over time. So part of why we launched this Pulse of the U.S. Workforce Report is that it's not just a snapshot, snap a chalk line and look at that data and assume that's what's representative. It truly is taking a pulse every single day across this large sample to make sure that it's representing a broad experience over time. Something you just said, thank you, Allison, for the question, and to the folks who are asking. Something you said, John, is how we see people with different political leanings see the role of business in society. And that's something we're very interested in, because when we look at what makes somebody's experience at work their experience at work, we see it as kind of a nested model. It's who you are as an individual, it's the people you work alongside, it's the company you work for, and then frankly, the broader society that you exist in and how you sort of are setting norms and expectations. This was an interesting one. So what we found here was that the political identity that people have, whether they lean liberal, lean moderate, or lean conservative, does have some differences in how people see the role of business in society, whether they trust companies, their perception of companies' responsibility to do the right thing, the trust in their own companies, not just major companies, and whether they believe business leaders are in it to do the right thing or not so much. So you see here, we tend to find liberals believe that business leaders don't often do the most positive thing for the world, whereas conservatives feel less strongly about that. We tend to see liberals have the least amount of trust in major corporations relative to moderates and conservatives. We see that liberals actually have a higher expectation of corporate responsibility than do moderate and conservative colleagues. And then on company trust, in terms of trusting the company leadership that they have, we see liberals trust their company similar to moderates, but far less than their conservative colleagues. So why I think this one's very interesting is, as somebody who led a CHRO, led an organization as a CHRO, to know that I'm walking into a room speaking to a population that presumably could be 50-50, maybe according to this data, 45-30-30. I'm coming from a very different place. I'm starting from a very different place in what they believe my role and our role as a company should be. So if you're a company leader, if you're somebody who's trying to set your brand up to be an employer brand that's in it to do the right thing or cares about consumers or trying to build trust, how people currently feel about you might be a longer line that you need to cross based on their political leaning. I thought this was a really interesting takeaway, just because it causes us to think, how do we influence and make sure that as companies, we're coming out and talking to people in a way that resonates for them, because some people just might distrust more than others.
Something I have to call out from this chart, particularly thinking back to the last one we looked at. First is that, note that trust in corporations, quote unquote,